My dad secretly transferred my $480K savings to my brother. He forgot I controlled the final account. It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas Eve, just like every other year. The scent of pine and cinnamon, the soft murmur of carols from the stereo, the clinking of ice in glasses as my father, Harold, poured himself another scotch. He looked older this year, the lines around his eyes deeper, his silver hair thinner. Mom had been gone 5 years now, and the holidays always felt a little hollower, a little more somber, even with my younger brother Ethan and his wife Chloe there. We were at Harold's sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the kind of place that had more fireplaces than bedrooms and a staff that moved through it like ghosts. I'd flown in from New York, leaving behind my own quiet apartment and the demanding life of a transactional attorney. Ethan, ever the golden boy, lived just across the bay with his wife and their 2 kids. He'd inherited the family business, Harold's company, a massive real estate development firm that had made us all very comfortable. Very, very comfortable. For years, Harold had been grooming Ethan, telling me privately, sometimes after a few too many drinks, that Ethan was the one who got it. Business, numbers, the future. I got the arts, the law, the messy human stuff. That's what he'd always said. He'd even funded my law school education, a generous gesture that I'd always been grateful for, despite the undertones. It was always about Ethan's inheritance, Ethan's future. My role was supportive, the smart daughter who could handle the legalities if needed, but never the main player. I never minded, not really. I'd built my own career, established my own financial independence. I had my savings, the $480,000 I'd meticulously accumulated over the last decade, a nest egg I was proud of. It was my safety net, my freedom fund, kept in a high-yield savings account at a small private bank downtown. Harold knew about it, of course. He'd always been involved in our finances, a habit that had never fully faded after Mom died. He liked to know everything, to have his finger on the pulse of all our lives, especially when it came to money. This Christmas, though, there was a different kind of tension in the air. Harold had been unusually quiet, his gaze often distant. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's a few months prior, a diagnosis that hung over our family like a shroud. We'd all tried to pretend it wasn't happening, that he was just tired. But the slips of memory, the moments of confusion, they were becoming more frequent. He'd insisted on this family gathering, almost as if he knew time was running out. Over the past few weeks, leading up to the holidays, he'd been calling me more often. Not about anything important, just checking in, asking about my work, my life. It felt different, almost like he was trying to gauge something. I chalked it up to his illness, a desire for connection. He'd always been a man of few words, his affections often expressed through financial security and grand gestures. The pre-dinner drinks were winding down. Chloe was in the kitchen, helping the caterers, her laughter a bright, sharp sound that always felt a little too loud in Harold's quiet house. Ethan was beside his father, engrossed in a hushed conversation about stock prices. I sat in one of the oversized armchairs, nursing a glass of wine, watching them. Harold's hand, thin and veined, rested on Ethan's arm. He looked frail. Then Harold turned to me. His eyes, usually so sharp, seemed unfocused for a moment. He cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said, his voice raspy, "I wanted to talk to you about something important." My heart gave a little lurch. This was it, I thought. The will. The distribution of assets. He hadn't made a new will since Mom died, and we'd all assumed the old one, which split everything equally between Ethan and me, would stand. "Sure, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the fireplace, to the flickering flames. "Your mother," he started, and my stomach tightened. He rarely brought her up like this. "She always wanted you to be secure, to have your own independence." He paused, then looked directly at me, and in his eyes, for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of his old self, a steely resolve. And I've made sure of that. He smiled, a strange, almost grim smile. Ethan and I were talking about the business, about the future, and we decided it would be best if all the liquid assets were consolidated under one roof, for efficiency. Liquid assets, my savings, the word echoed in my head. "Consolidated?" I repeated, my voice a little thinner than I intended. "What do you mean?" Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. It was a bank statement. Not from my bank, but from Ethan's. And at the top, in bold letters, was the name of a major financial institution. I unfolded it, my fingers trembling slightly. The transaction history was brief. just a few entries. Then I saw it, a withdrawal, dated just last week. The amount listed, $480,000. And the recipient? Ethan. My savings. Transferred. My mind reeled. This wasn't possible. This was a mistake. Dad, I said, my voice rising. This is my savings. My $480,000. Harold smiled wider. Yes, Sarah. Your savings. I transferred them to Ethan. For the business. He's the one who needs the capital. You're a lawyer. You don't need it. You have your salary. He said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. My vision blurred. The room seemed to spin. Humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. My father, the man who had always preached about my independence, who had supposedly wanted me secure, had just stolen my life savings and given it to my brother, without a word to me.
He hadn't even asked. He'd taken it. The money I'd worked so hard for, saved diligently, the money that represented my freedom, my future, gone. Handed over to Ethan, who already had everything. Ethan, who was living in a mansion, running a multi-million-dollar company, whose financial future was already more secure than most people's entire lives. My throat closed up. I couldn't speak. I felt a cold dread creep into my chest, an icy tendril of betrayal. Ethan looked up, a slight frown on his face. "What's that, Sarah?" he asked, his voice laced with concern, or perhaps something else, curiosity. He'd always had a keen sense for these things. He saw the statement in my hand. Harold placed a hand on Ethan's arm, his expression softening. "Sarah's upset, Ethan. I just explained that I transferred her savings to you. For the business. It's for the best." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Then he turned to me, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Was it guilt? Triumph? He stood up and walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt alien, intrusive. "Sarah, Dad's right. It's a temporary thing, just until we get this new development project off the ground. It's going to be huge, and we needed a bit of a cash infusion. Dad thought, well, he thought it was the most logical way to handle it." The most logical way. The words hit me like a physical blow. Logical. He saw my life savings, my hard-earned independence, as a mere cash infusion for his precious son's project. My $480,000, meticulously saved from my own efforts, reduced to a convenient line item in Ethan's booming financial empire? The anger started to simmer beneath the surface, a low, dangerous heat. It was so arrogant, so dismissive, so them. My father, the patriarch, doling out what he considered his rightful spoils. My brother, the favored heir, accepting it without question. And me, the daughter, the lawyer, the one who understood contracts and asset protection better than anyone, treated like a child, my autonomy completely disregarded. I stood up, my legs feeling a little shaky, but my resolve hardening with every passing second. The humiliation was still there, a raw wound, but it was being overshadowed by something else, a cold, calculating clarity. Harold watched me, his expression unreadable. Ethan's hand was still on my shoulder, and I shrugged it off, stepping back. "A temporary thing?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You transferred my money, Dad, without my consent, without even asking me." Harold waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Sarah, don't be so dramatic. It's just money, and it's going to Ethan. He'll use it to make more money. That's the point, isn't it? Growth, prosperity." Prosperity? For whom? I looked at Ethan, who was now watching me with a guarded expression. He knew I was good with numbers, that I was meticulous. He knew I understood the implications of this. He also knew I was a lawyer, a good one. He probably thought I'd just accept it, that I'd be too proud or too scared to fight him. My father certainly did. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. The carols from the stereo suddenly sounded mocking. Chloe appeared in the doorway, a serving platter in her hands, her smile faltering as she took in the scene. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. Harold sighed, a weary sound. "Sarah's being a bit emotional, Chloe, over a minor transfer." Minor transfer. My $480,000, my entire savings, my carefully constructed financial independence, gone.
My mind, trained to dissect legal documents, to find loopholes and leverage, began to whir. He forgot. He always forgot the details. He saw the big picture, the grand gestures, the control, but the specifics, the fine print, that was my domain. He'd always underestimated me, always seen my legal mind as a tool for the family, never as a weapon of my own. He'd forgotten the final account, the one he didn't have access to, the one that was solely mine, the one where I'd put a specific instruction, a safety measure he never would have considered. A slow, cold smile began to form on my lips. The humiliation was still there, a bitter taste, but it was being swallowed by a growing sense of anticipation. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The game had just begun. The air in the room was suddenly charged, the comfortable Christmas Eve ambiance shattered. I could feel their eyes on me, Harold's shrewd and slightly confused, Ethan's a mixture of surprise and a dawning unease, Chloe's wide with bewildered concern. The silence that followed my calm, measured response was deafening. It wasn't the silence of resignation, but the taut, vibrating quiet that precedes an explosion, or perhaps a carefully orchestrated counterstrike. My father, for all his waning faculties, recognized the shift. The faintest trace of that old, sharp intelligence flickered in his eyes. He saw that the minor transfer had to me been a seismic event, and not one I intended to simply absorb. Emotional, I repeated, my voice still low, but carrying an edge that made Ethan shift his weight. Dad, you took my entire life savings, the money I earned, the money I painstakingly saved for a decade, and gave it to my brother for a business venture he's been talking about for years, a venture that, might I add, has yet to materialize in any concrete way beyond projections and wishful thinking. That's not emotional. That's a breach of trust on a fundamental level. I let my gaze drift to Ethan, then back to Harold. And the fact that you did it without a word, without consulting me, as if my financial autonomy meant absolutely nothing, that, Dad, is what's truly remarkable. Chloe, bless her heart, tried to smooth things over. Harold, Sarah has a point. It's a lot of money, and it is Sarah's money.
Maybe we should all just sit down, have another drink, and talk this through properly once everyone's a little more relaxed. Her words, meant to be placating, only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Talk it through, as if reasoned discussion could undo a unilateral seizure of assets. Harold waved her away again, his focus solely on me. Sarah, you're a lawyer. You understand business. This money is best utilized by Ethan. He's the future of this family's enterprise. You have your career. You're perfectly capable of earning more. He still sounded so certain, so convinced of his own logic. It was the logic of a man who had always controlled the purse strings, who had always dictated the flow of wealth. He saw me as a responsible adult in theory, but in practice, he still viewed me as the little girl who needed him to manage her allowances. I understand business, Dad, I said, my voice dropping another notch. The simmering rage was starting to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. And I understand contracts. I understand asset protection. And I understand bank policies. You transferred the money from my account at Sterling Private Bank. Is that correct? Harold nodded, a slight impatience in his gesture. Yes, that's correct. Your account there. Ethan handled the final paperwork with his advisor, but the funds came from your account. He looked pleased with himself, as if he'd just explained a complex transaction with perfect clarity. He'd given Ethan the how, but he'd forgotten the what else. Ethan handled the paperwork, I echoed, my eyes fixed on my father. With his advisor. At Sterling Private Bank. Interesting. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. The kind of smile that promises future unpleasantness. Dad, you know I've been working at Sterling for the last 3 years, right? As a senior counsel, overseeing their compliance and risk management departments, among other things. The air in the room shifted again. Ethan's confident posture faltered. Harold's gaze narrowed, a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like alarm beginning to surface. Chloe's eyes darted between us, a dawning comprehension in their depths. You work at Sterling? Harold asked, his voice less certain now. I thought you were still with that big firm downtown. I left that firm 18 months ago, Dad, I said gently.
letting the words hang in the sudden tense quiet. Sterling offered me a more challenging role, and frankly, better compensation. I paused, letting the implications sink in. It's funny, isn't it? How careers can change, how positions can evolve. It means I have a unique perspective on Sterling's operations, their security protocols, their internal controls, and especially their client agreements. Ethan stepped forward, his usual easy confidence replaced by a tense wariness. What are you getting at, Sarah?
I'm getting at the fact, Ethan, I said, turning my attention to him, my voice laced with a chillingly polite curiosity, that you transferred $480,000 out of my account at Sterling, and I have a rather specific set of instructions filed with that account, a security measure, if you will, something I put in place a couple of years ago after Mom's passing, when Dad started getting forgetful, a way to ensure absolute control over my primary assets should anything unforeseen happen. Harold's face had gone pale. He'd always prided himself on his intellect, his foresight, his absolute mastery of financial machinations. The idea that I, his daughter, the one he deemed too emotional for business, had outmaneuvered him on his own turf with his own trusted institution was clearly a bitter pill. What instructions? He demanded, his voice tight. Instructions that required dual authorization for any withdrawal exceeding $50,000, I explained, my tone as dry and precise as any legal brief, and not just any authorization, specific, verifiably personal authorization linked to biometric data, a failsafe against exactly this kind of unilateral action. My father, it seems, forgot about that little clause in my Sterling account agreement, the one I helped draft, ironically, a clause designed to protect against things like this. Ethan stared at me, his jaw working. You're lying. There's no way that's true. Is there? I challenged, raising an eyebrow. You handled the paperwork, Ethan. You must have encountered some resistance, some unexpected hurdles. Did your advisor mention anything about secondary verification, about needing my personal, verifiable consent, even for a transfer initiated by my father's request? Did he perhaps, in his haste to facilitate your father's logical consolidation of assets, overlook the fine print that stated I, Sarah Thorne, alone hold the ultimate veto power on any sum over $50,000 from my Sterling account? The color had completely drained from Ethan's face. He looked, for the first time in my memory, genuinely rattled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Chloe gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. You put that in place? Harold stammered, his composure fracturing. You deliberately set a trap for us? Not a trap, Dad, I corrected, my voice soft, almost pitying. A safeguard, a measure to ensure my own financial security. You wanted to consolidate assets? Fine. But you underestimated who you were dealing with. You saw my savings as your personal slush fund, a convenience for your son's ambition. I saw them as my independence, and I took steps to protect that independence. My father's eyes, which had held a paternal authority for so long, now seemed to shrink. He'd always operated on the assumption of his own inherent power, his own irrefutable control. He'd forgotten that the world didn't always bend to his will, especially not a world I had meticulously constructed with my own two hands, within the very system he relied upon. The humiliation I'd felt minutes earlier was a distant memory, replaced by a potent, almost exhilarating sense of vindication. He'd given my money to Ethan, thinking it was a simple transaction. He'd forgotten that I controlled the final gate. So what happens now? Ethan asked, his voice a tight whisper. He was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as his sister, but as a formidable opponent. What happens now, I said, the words deliberate and heavy, is that the money remains in my account at Sterling, because without my explicit, verified consent, which I am not going to give, that transfer is null and void. It's as if it never happened. Your advisor, Ethan, will be facing some very serious questions from Sterling's compliance department. I can assure you, the fallout for him, and potentially for you, will be significant. Harold stood up slowly, his hands trembling. He looked less like the imposing patriarch and more like a frail old man, lost and confused. You're doing this? You're going to fight us? Over money? It's not just about the money, Dad, I said, my voice hardening.
It's about respect. It's about autonomy. It's about the fact that you both, in your own ways, have consistently treated me as a secondary player in my own life. You, by dictating my worth based on my perceived utility to your son and your empire. And you, Ethan, by accepting that narrative without question, by always assuming you were entitled to whatever the family wealth could provide, regardless of the cost to anyone else. I walked over to the window, looking out at the manicured lawns of the estate, bathed in the soft glow of the holiday lights. It was a beautiful house, a symbol of generations of wealth and power. But tonight, it felt like a gilded cage, and I had just discovered the key. You saw my savings as a temporary loan, a resource to be tapped for your convenience, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of my convictions. I saw them as the tangible proof of my independence, the security that allowed me to build my own life, separate from the Thorne dynasty. And you, Dad, in your attempt to logically consolidate everything under Ethan's control, inadvertently handed me the perfect tool to expose just how illogical and respectful your actions were. You forgot that I'm not just a lawyer, I'm a Thorne, and I've learned from the best how to protect what's mine. Ethan took a step towards me, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and desperation. Sarah, this is insane. You're going to ruin everything. He's not himself. You can't do this to him. He's not himself, but he's still capable of making decisions that affect my life, I retorted, turning to face him, my gaze unwavering. And you, Ethan, you're perfectly lucid.
You understood what you were doing. You saw an opportunity to solidify your position, to ensure your father's legacy, and you didn't hesitate to use my assets to do it. You saw my $480,000 as a stepping stone, not as the culmination of years of my hard work and sacrifice. Harold sank back into his armchair, his face a mask of weary resignation. He looked defeated, not by the loss of money, but by the realization that his carefully constructed control had been so easily circumvented. He'd underestimated my resolve, my intelligence, and my willingness to fight for what was rightfully mine. So, what's your endgame, Sarah? Ethan demanded, his voice raw. You want the money back? Fine, take it. Just don't do this. Don't drag Dad through this. Don't make this ugly. The money is already back where it belongs, Ethan, I said, a cold satisfaction spreading through me. It never left my control. And as for making this ugly, I believe you and Dad already took care of that. My endgame is simple. I will not be marginalized. I will not be taken for granted. And I will absolutely not have my financial independence dictated by anyone, especially not by my father and brother who seem to believe my life's work is merely a footnote in their grander ambitions. I looked at Chloe, who was watching me with a pained expression. Chloe, I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, but you're married to Ethan, you're part of this family, and you need to understand that this isn't just about money, it's about how we treat each other. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken resentments and dawning realizations. Harold stared blankly into the fire, his mind seemingly lost in a fog of his own making, or perhaps a fog I had helped to thicken. Ethan stood rigid, his fists clenched, his face a mask of frustrated rage. He knew he'd been outplayed, not by legal trickery in a courtroom, but by foresight and a deep understanding of the systems he'd so carelessly tried to manipulate. I'll be leaving now, I announced, my voice clear and steady. I have an early flight back to New York. I suggest you both have a long, hard conversation about your priorities. And Ethan, you might want to have a very frank discussion with your advisor about professional ethics. Sterling has a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of misconduct. I picked up my coat from the back of a chair, the familiar weight settling on my shoulders. The expensive wool felt like armor. As I walked towards the grand double doors, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on me, the stunned silence of a family whose carefully curated image of unity and prosperity had just been irrevocably fractured. The humiliation had been a catalyst, the silence that followed a period of intense private contemplation, and the control I now felt was a cold, hard certainty. They had underestimated me, and now they would pay the price. The game had indeed begun, and they had just learned the first brutal rule. I played to win. The true reckoning was still to come, and it would be delivered not with shouting or tears, but with a chillingly precise, meticulously executed plan. And they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. The drive back to the city was long, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had settled over the Thorne estate. This was a silence I had cultivated, a deliberate withdrawal into myself to plan. The initial shock, The surge of adrenaline that had seen me through the confrontation was fading, replaced by a deeper, more chilling resolve. I replayed their faces, Harold's bewildered frustration, Ethan's seething disbelief, Chloe's quiet, almost sorrowful gaze. They saw me as an anomaly, a glitch in their predictable system. They thought the money was the point. They were so wrong. The money was just the lever. Back in my New York apartment, the sterile efficiency of the city felt like a balm. No sprawling lawns, no suffocating traditions, just clean lines and the hum of possibility. For days, I didn't contact anyone. I immersed myself in work, not just the routine tasks, but digging deeper, leveraging my position at Sterling. I learned about offshore accounts, about shell corporations, about the intricate web of trusts and holdings that the Thorne family had meticulously woven over decades. Harold, in his arrogance, had always believed he was untouchable, his wealth a fortress. He taught me everything I knew about strategy, about anticipating the opponent's moves. He just never expected me to use those lessons against him. I started small, a few discreet inquiries about past transactions, a subtle probe into loan applications filed by Ethan's nascent business ventures. I was looking for leverage, for vulnerabilities. Sterling, for all its elite clientele, was still a business, and businesses have records. Compliance departments have memories, and I knew intimately the pressure points of institutions like Sterling. A hint of regulatory scrutiny, a whisper of potential fraud, and doors that had been firmly shut would creak open. Ethan's business, Thorne Innovations, was a perpetual motion machine of debt and deferred dreams. He'd presented it as a groundbreaking tech startup. In reality, it was a black hole for Harold's generosity, propped up by a series of increasingly dubious loans and investor pitches that smelled strongly of desperation. Harold had poured his own funds into it, yes, but he'd also leveraged his reputation, his considerable influence to secure financing. And that, I discovered, was where things got interesting. There were whispers of a significant overseas investment that had mysteriously evaporated. There were overdue invoices, contracts signed with companies that seemed to exist only on paper, and a disturbing pattern of using personal assets as collateral for business loans that never quite paid off.
It wasn't just a bad investment. It was a cascade of poor decisions, potentially bordering on reckless endangerment of capital. Harold, in his dotage, might have been blind, but the bank's internal risk assessments, the ones I now had access to, were not. I started making calls, not to Ethan, not to Harold, but to people Ethan had dealt with. Small-time investors he'd charmed, former partners he'd left in the lurch, suppliers he'd stiffed. I posed as a freelance financial journalist working on a piece about emerging tech entrepreneurs. They were surprisingly eager to talk, their stories a tapestry of broken promises and misplaced trust. They painted a picture of Ethan not as a visionary, but as a smooth-talking charmer who promised the moon and delivered dust. And Harold, bless his stubborn pride, had been too invested in his son's success to see the cracks. The real gold, however, lay in Harold's own dealings. He wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a titan who had navigated the cutthroat world of real estate development for decades. His empire was built on leverage, on deals struck in smoke-filled rooms, and on a certain degree of aggressive maneuvering that often blurred ethical lines. He'd always boasted about his ability to bend rules, to find loopholes, but some loopholes, I now realized, were more akin to traps. There was a series of land acquisitions on the outskirts of Philadelphia, deals that had been mired in controversy years ago, rumors of insider trading, of zoning violations that had been conveniently overlooked. Harold had always managed to skirt the official investigations, his lawyers a formidable shield. But records existed. Emails, internal memos, the paper trail was undeniable, even if it had been buried deep. I compiled a discreet dossier, not a confession, not an accusation, but a factual, meticulously documented account of irregularities. I focused on points that Sterling Bank, given its strict adherence to regulations, would find impossible to ignore. The kind of evidence that could trigger a cascade of internal reviews and potentially external inquiries. My target wasn't to ruin them overnight, but to systematically dismantle the foundations of their wealth and reputation. The second phase of my plan involved Chloe. She was the quiet observer, the one who always seemed to be caught between her loyalty to Ethan and her inherent sense of fairness. I hadn't spoken to her since Christmas Eve, but I knew her email address. I sent her a single message, no preamble, no explanation. Just a link. The link led to a secure, encrypted folder containing a curated selection of the most damning documents I had compiled. It included Harold's questionable land deals with specific references to the legal departments at Sterling that had been involved in underwriting some of the associated financing.
It also included evidence of Ethan's increasingly risky business practices, highlighting the potential for significant financial losses that could easily impact their shared assets. I didn't ask for a response. I simply stated in the email, "For your consideration." The response, when it came, was not immediate, but it was profound. A few days later, I received a brief, almost hesitant call from Chloe. Her voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Sarah?" "Chloe," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. I saw what you sent," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" "I'm protecting myself, Chloe," I said, the words firm. "And I'm ensuring that those who acted with disrespect and entitlement are held accountable. You're married to Ethan. You're his partner. You're invested in his success. But you're also part of this family, and you deserve to know the truth about the risks that have been taken, risks that could affect you, and eventually, your children." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of Chloe's uneven breathing. "Harold, he's been so unwell. He's not himself. He trusts Ethan implicitly." "And that trust has been exploited," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm just asking you to see, to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Your husband is gambling with your future, and your father-in-law is enabling it, perhaps unknowingly. But ignorance is no longer an excuse, is it? Not when the truth has been laid bare." She wept softly on the other end of the line, a sound of deep distress and dawning fear. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want what is mine," I said, the conviction in my voice absolute. "And I want them to understand that there are consequences. Consequences for taking what doesn't belong to you. Consequences for underestimating me. I don't want their apologies. I don't want their remorse. I want them to live with the reality of their choices, just as I have had to live with the consequences of theirs." The real storm broke about 2 weeks later. It wasn't a dramatic public spectacle. It was far more insidious, far more devastating. Sterling Bank initiated a comprehensive review of the Thorne family's financial dealings, prompted by a series of anonymous but highly specific tips that mirrored the information I had carefully disseminated. The bank's internal compliance department, alerted to potential irregularities in Harold's past transactions and Ethan's current ventures, began to dig. Suddenly, loans that had been easily approved were frozen. Investment opportunities that had seemed sure bets evaporated. Harold, already frail, was subjected to rigorous questioning by bank officials and their legal teams. The pressure was immense, and the implications were stark. If the review uncovered significant breaches of financial law or regulatory guidelines, not only would Harold's assets be frozen, but his reputation, built over a lifetime, would be irrevocably tarnished. Ethan, meanwhile, found his own precarious financial house of cards collapsing. The anonymous tips had also flagged his business practices to a number of key creditors and potential investors. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the discrepancies, the missing funds, the suspiciously absent company that was supposed to be his primary supplier. His carefully constructed facade began to crumble. I received a call, not from Ethan, but from Harold's personal attorney. The tone was starkly different from the dismissive arrogance I'd encountered before. It was urgent, laced with a thinly veiled desperation. Harold was in the hospital, having suffered a minor stroke. The stress, the attorney implied, had taken its toll. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "your father is asking for you. He regrets how things have transpired. He wants to talk." I flew back to Philadelphia. The Thorne estate, usually a beacon of opulent holiday cheer, was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive gloom. The lights were on, but they seemed to cast long, mournful shadows. The air was thick with unspoken dread. Harold lay in a large, ornate bed in his study, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. His right side was weak, his speech slurred, but his eyes, when they found mine, held a flicker of the old Thorne shrewdness, now tinged with a profound, gut-wrenching regret. Ethan sat by his father's side, his face a mask of exhaustion and a fear I hadn't seen before. Chloe was there too, her expression one of quiet sorrow,
her hand resting gently on Harold's arm. The grand family living room, where the confrontation had begun, was now a silent testament to their unraveling. "Sarah," Harold rasped, his voice a labored whisper. "My girl." I walked to his bedside, not with triumph, but with a somber sense of inevitability. I sat beside him, taking his frail hand in mine. It felt cold and clammy. "Dad," I said softly. "I was wrong," he murmured, his eyes clouded. "So wrong. I thought I was protecting the family legacy. I thought Ethan was the future." He coughed, a weak, rattling sound. I didn't see what you had become." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, you don't need to do this. It's not your fault." "It is my fault, Ethan," Harold wheezed, his gaze fixed on his son. "I gave you too much power. I let you believe you were invincible. And I underestimated my daughter." He turned his gaze back to me. "You were always the smart one, Sarah. Always the one who saw the details. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you." A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. "You played the game brilliantly. I taught you well. Too well, perhaps."
The confession, the acknowledgement of his error, hung in the air, heavy and profound. It wasn't an apology in the conventional sense, but it was an admission of defeat, a concession of his flawed judgment. "The bank," Harold continued, his voice barely audible. They're freezing everything. Ethan's deals, they're falling apart. My reputation." He closed his eyes, a tremor running through his body. "It's all gone. Because of my pride. Because I couldn't see you as anything other than what I wanted you to be." I looked at Ethan. He met my gaze, his eyes hollow, the arrogant entitlement replaced by a stark fear. He knew, I think, that he had not only lost his father's trust, but his own future, his own legacy. He had bet everything on his father's unwavering support, and now that support was gone, replaced by the cold, hard hand of consequence. Chloe squeezed Harold's hand, her eyes meeting mine with a silent plea, a shared understanding of the devastation. She hadn't stood with me actively, but by accepting the truth I'd presented, by not denying it, she had, in her own way, played a crucial role. "What happens now, Sarah?" Ethan asked, his voice devoid of his usual confidence, a raw vulnerability in its tone. I looked at my father, frail and broken, his empire crumbling around him. I looked at my brother, stripped of his illusion of control. I looked at Chloe, caught in the wreckage. "Now," I said, my voice steady and calm, "we all live with the consequences of our choices. Dad, you made your choices. Ethan, you made yours. I made mine." I didn't gloat. There was no pleasure in this desolation, only a profound sense of finality. My money is safe. My independence is assured. The rest is for you to sort out. I stood up. The air in the room felt lighter, not with joy, but with the release of immense tension. The fight was over. The humiliation was a distant memory. The silence had been filled with strategy and execution, and now the control was undeniable. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the dismantling of a system that had consistently undervalued me. As I walked out of the study, leaving them to their reckoning, I felt a profound sense of quiet exhaustion. It wasn't the triumphant fist-pumping victory of a Hollywood movie. It was the quiet, soul-deep weariness of someone who had fought a long, brutal war and emerged not unscathed, but victorious. The Thorne legacy was broken, not by an external enemy, but by internal rot, by pride, and by an underestimation of the quiet strength of the one they had dismissed. I had taken back not just my money, but my agency, and in the silent, echoing halls of the estate, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never be underestimated again. The inheritance was mine, not just in wealth, but in the hard-won knowledge that my own strength was the most valuable asset of all.